on a-NOMICS.
All right. So, how many of you were at the lecture last night? Not last night, but yesterday for the MLK Day of Service. Okay, some of you were there. Great. It's interesting because some people accuse me of being too black and being too aggressive in my delivery. And what I say to that is, well, I guess I just gotta be more black and more aggressive, right? And so the title of my lesson today is Black a-NOMICS, because we want to focus on the economical situation of African Americans, black people in general, Africans that are descent from slaves that are currently here in America. And we want to focus on that because we're at a crossroads right now in our country that calls for more attention. Actually, we've always been at this crossroads, but some way, somehow, shape, or another, the economics of black people has always been pushed to the back of the line as far as issues. I mean, you have people that focus on civil rights and police brutality and all noble things to focus on. However, the economic portion has always been put on the back burner. And one of the reasons why is because our education system does not teach us on how to really cogently and efficiently think about these issues, and furthermore, not just think about these issues, but how to actually address the problems of the issues. So I want to begin here and focus on black capital in this country, how black bodies were used to further capitalism in this country, and how those black people addressed that and were able to do for themselves. Now, we've all heard the house slave and the field slave. We heard that before, right? How many of you heard of that? The house slave did work in the house, typically of lighter complexion, and the field slave did work in the fields, typically of darker complexion, right? And we know that the slave master did this, organized this, in part to make sure that black people work against each other, right? But there's another sect of people, of slaves, that's not often talked about when discussing slavery, right? Which in of itself makes you think, what is the point of education in our country, right? When it comes to education about what really happened during slavery. And so the third sect of slaves that's not so often talked about, but was very prominent, especially towards the latter years of slavery leading up to the Civil War, was the slave entrepreneur and the slave entrepreneur. How many of you heard of the slave entrepreneur and entrepreneur? Besides those who took my Black Wall Street class, right? How many of you heard of that before? So again, as I said, so only one person in a room of almost 100 people have heard of the slave entrepreneur and entrepreneur. So you already thought you heard as much as you need to hear about slavery. Well, Dr. Jumo, why are we talking about this? Because it's important to establish a foundation, an intellectual foundation based on research, exactly the problem that still is reoccurring today. So let's get to it. So those of you who want to take notes, you can take notes. Slave entrepreneurs of both genders were slaves who hired their own time from their owners and established business enterprises as sole proprietors. So again, even as slaves, you know, that's not to say that they still were not treated as a slave. They still were not robbed of their humanity, because they were. Just as much as black people still to this day are robbed of their humanity. But what it is saying is that as a slave entrepreneur, the master, the slave master, the white male slave master, allowed slaves who had acquired in some way, shape, or form skills. Now, how did they acquire these skills? Some brought those skills over from the continent of Africa, specifically in West Africa. as far as, farming, as far as welding, as far as carpentry, and pass those skills on to their offspring or whoever was left in the slave quarters because as we typically know, the slave owner at any point in time could sell off a slave, right? Can sell off a slave person. And so, again, the slave entrepreneur, how this was developed was that the slave entrepreneur, the master, they recognized that a specific skill that the slave had, right? Whether they remembered it in some way, shape, or form from back in the continent of Africa, or they were taught it by the slave master. So typically a lot of people don't understand this, but the first educational institution for black people, for slaves in this country, was the slave quarters, right? That was the first educational institution where these slaves over time had learned a high skill, right? And that's important to know because, isn't it funny today we're at a predominantly white institution that has a curriculum that is Eurocentric in nature, right? You're being taught how to think and how to act, right? You're being taught how to socialize from a Eurocentric perspective. This isn't from an Afrocentric perspective. It's from a European perspective, Eurocentric perspective. And so the same thing was done back then, as we say, right? As far as the slave entrepreneur. So the slave entrepreneur, once the slave entrepreneur, a slave gained those skills that was typical high skills for that day. So whether we talk about shipbuilding, whether we're talking about carpentry, whether we're talking about plumbing, or even whether we're talking about the skills to run an entire plantation, right? The owner then sent that slave out. Well, typically what happened was when it first started out, there was an agent that was in charge, or a white male that was an agent that went from plantation to plantation, procuring these slaves. And what did they call them? They called these agents nigger traders, right? They called them nigger traders. And so the responsibility of these people was to procure work for these highly skilled slaves, right? That was the sole purpose. So then eventually, once a slave learned the circuit, the gamut of what was going on, they would be able to hire their own selves out to different plantations and to different entities. So sometimes a slave entrepreneur, maybe they need to be a waiter, right? Or maybe they need to be a butler at another house, and maybe the slave owner, they just got tired of that slave as far as maybe back talk, or maybe they really did generally take an interest in that slave, and the best way for that slave to free themselves and to free their family, that slave owner allowed that slave to procure a wage. Now, of course, the slave owner took the majority of the wages, right? Because at the end of the day, you're still a what? Slave. And so allowed that slave entrepreneur to keep a little bit of that wage and eventually over time build up to being able to purchase their freedom. And so this is what we're talking about, because again, this is very important because a lot of people don't understand this. They think, oh, a house slave or a free slave saved up money to buy their freedom. No, you sound ignorant when you propagate that. That's not what happened. So now then we have the slave entrepreneur. These slaves were granted the decision-making authority in managing the businesses of their owners. Some given authority to hire and even negotiate contracts by the owner, right? So again, you're still a slave. You're still in a subservient position in society. But the master, recognizing the skills that you had, and maybe one of those skills was you maybe could read, but in those days you typically didn't necessarily have to read to be successful in this capitalistic system, right? And so, as a slave entrepreneur, the master allowed the slaves, as an entrepreneur, recognizing the skill set that they had in managing, allowed them to run the plantation. And this was very typical, especially when the Civil War happened, right? Or any other type of situation in which it calls for the slave master to go off of the plantation, right? And so this is where the slave entrepreneur comes into effect. And then also slave entrepreneurs had the opportunity to make money, while slave entrepreneurs could generate their own income from the enterprises that they established. So again, the point of this slide is to tell you that black people have always been in this country since 1619, always had the wherewithal and the know-how and the ability to establish what? Individual enterprises, right? So don't let nobody tell you that, slaves were just blind and dumb. It's not true. Because what you're doing, when you allow people to feed that into your spirit, especially as a black person, and even white people too, right? It's almost as if it gives the impression that your history started after slavery. Like there was nothing noble before slavery or even during slavery. Now, of course, I'm not saying that slavery was noble. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying here is that the intelligence was still there. How else can a people survive 400 years of oppression and beating and without having the wherewithal and the know-how to survive, right? And part of that survival in this capitalistic system was being able to procure income, and even at that point as a slave, being able to procure that income, right? So demonstration. So slaves who wanted to become entrepreneurs had to demonstrate to their owners the monetary advantages that would accrue to the owners if the slaves were allowed full independence in pursuing economic activity. So again, it's no different than today, right? You have to prove to the people that are hiring you, right? And most of the people that are hiring you, that are in position to hire you, are what? White. And I'm not saying that all white people are racist, so don't misquote me on that, because I know some of you would get into these group chats. Oh, did you know about it? No, I got it on tape, right? But typically, this is the situation. Just as the slaves back then, a slave entrepreneur is first hired out by his owner, and then they move into a position of hiring their own time. So what? We see the first incidents here of what? A promotion, right? This is a promotion. A slave entrepreneur first hired out by his owner, and then they move into a position of hiring their own time. So once they show a little bit of trust and loyalty to the owner, then the owner said, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of autonomy. I'm not going to hire a nigger trader to come and shop you around, right? I'm going to allow you the autonomy to hire your own time out, to procure your own services. But at the end of the day, the wages that you get, the majority of that come to me. I got to collect my check. Because it's still a business and you're still property. Right? You're still property. And, okay, thank you. And so many successful slave entrepreneurs were craftsmen, especially in construction. Many slave entrepreneurs succeeded not only due to expertise, but also because what? They underbid their white competitors. And the thing about it is, at a certain point in time in certain states in the South, especially leading up to the Civil War, there were more highly skilled slaves that were slave entrepreneurs who were able to hire their own time out more than lowly skilled white men, right? White men who did not own slaves, right? But they were still white men, right? So at one point in time, there were more highly skilled slaves that were able to hire their own time out than low-skilled white men. So what happens? What happens is that because of this fact, a lot of the lowly skilled and poorly educated, as they say, in that time period, white men, they were jealous of those black slaves who were getting that. Because why? As a hirer, as a employer, and we see this thing reoccurring, right? It's all about how to cut costs, how to cut corners. So who am I going to hire? A white man who demands $5, or am I going to hire a slave entrepreneur who could do the same type of job, and maybe even better, because he'd been learning that job on the plantation with the whip at his back, right? And hired that same slave to do that same job for only $1 an hour. As a business person, who are you going to go with, right? So again, so this is why this sect of slave entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs is not told as much in our history books, which is why having an Afrocentric education first and foremost is very important, and having and taking our Black Studies courses is very important as well, so you can get this information, right? Next slide. And so I put this graphic up because in setting the foundation, talented 10th. And so we have a propensity today in our society, but especially in the Black community, to want to separate ourselves via labels, this and that and this title, that title, this organization, that organization, you know, and putting our self-worth more than what it really is. And so you have a situation where some people in the community call themselves the talented 10th, right? And so as I just proved to you, with this slave entrepreneurship and slave entrepreneurship, at the end of the day, whether you want to say you're you're a slave entrepreneur, you're a slave entrepreneur, whether you want to say you're a house slave, whether you're a field slave, what are you still? A slave, right? And so in looking at this talented 10th and this ideology of the talented 10th and how it plays into our economy and our society, this idea that some Black people will say that, you know, we are the talented 10th. And I say, well, what about the other 90th? Are not the other 90th just as talented in some way, shape? What makes you the talented 10th versus the other 90? Because of some title that society really doesn't value, right? And so this is very important because, first and foremost, not many people understand that the talented 10th ideology was advanced by whom? A white man, Henry Morehouse. Henry Morehouse. So in an essay entitled Talented 10th, first published in April 1896, same year of what major ruling? You guys should know this. If you Black in this country, you should know this. Plessy versus Ferguson. What was so important about Plessy versus Ferguson?
It established his right to present himself in court. Separate but equal.
Separate but equal doctrine. It established separate but equal doctrine, which is very important. So, which by way establishes what? Jim Crow-ism, right? So during the same year of 1896, same year that Jim Crow is officially established by the Supreme Court, Henry Morehouse, a white man, for whom Morehouse College is named after, right? Which a lot of HBCUs are named after white men. And white women too. Spelman is named after a white woman, right? Did you know that? Spelman, she was married to Rockefeller. Did you know that? Wow, we don't know as much as we think we know. You see that? But we profess to be the talented 10th, but only have not even a 1% of any type of knowledge on anything. So anyway, so established by Henry Morehouse, and so he coined this in 1896 in the Independent magazine. And what he said was, how did he define this term? In a discussion concerning Negro education, we should not forget that the talented 10th man in ordinary education may answer for the 9 men of mediocrity. But if this is all we offer the talented 10th man, we make a prodigious mistake. And then he goes on to say, the 10th man with superior natural endowments. The 10th man with superior natural endowments. So what is Henry Morehouse doing? He's propagating some fake scientific pseudoscience as far as Black people is concerned. And even still to this day, you still have some people who still come to believe this. Well, we are the talented 10th, but because we're just so divinely the talented 10th. right? And so as we will see later, what does it really mean as far as the actual return on investment? As far as your net worth, as far as your worth in this country? What does that label mean? And it's really important because, again, in looking at this talented, all black people are talented. For how else do we survive 400 years of oppression? All black people are talented. So I'm declaring a death sentence right now to that term, the talented 10. I'm declaring a death sentence to it because, first and foremost, if we're going to move forward as a people, if black people are going to be moving forward as a people in establishing some type of economic foundation, you first have to get rid of these fake labels that do nothing more than is used to work against us. You have to get rid of it. You have to get rid of the thinking. Even at the University of Florida, you have some people, in all colleges, right? You have some people who feel that because they are talented in whatever capacity, that they, that the rules don't apply to them. Almost. The rules don't apply. All right, move forward. All right, so return on investment. So when people ask, right, why is he talking about slavery? Why is he talking about intolerance? Why is he talking about this black talk? The first thing why is he so aggressive? The first question I want to ask you, what type of education are you being taught to create for yourself? What type of education? What type of education are you learning at the University of Florida or any other school that you have went to previously? Have you learned to actually create for yourself? And not only create for yourself, but create opportunities for your community. What type of education? The second question I want to ask you, what type of psychology is in place to keep you thinking that you have to be a servant? Right? What type of psychology is in place to keep you thinking this way? That you forever think that you're nothing more than just a servant. You can't be a boss. Not only just be a boss, but you can't be a creator. What type of psychology is in place for that? Who's teaching you this psychology? Who's teaching you to think that way? What type of society is teaching you to think that way? What type of different marketing and different symbols are being thrown your way to keep you thinking from a level of being a servant? What type of stereotypes do you internalize? Who are feeding you these stereotypes about yourself, right? And how conducive are these stereotypes to your survival, right? Or lack of survival? What type of family values are you taught? Is family even valued anymore in 2019? What type of values do you have? Right? How much has social capital developed? And I have another host of questions that I want to ask you as far as in thinking about this thing of servitude and slavery. They say, well, Dr. Adejumo, how can I be a slave? And the question I ask you is, well, what type of name do you respond to? As Dr. Amos Wilson say, is it the name of your ancestors? What type of uniform do you wear? Is it the same uniform of your ancestors? What type of food do you eat? Right? Is it that down-home cooking, soul food, right? The food that sticks to your ribs, right? But sends you to an early grave, but you don't care because it tastes so good? And then the last question I want to ask you, what strand of Christianity do you follow? Is it the same strand that teaches you forgive, forgive, forgive. But when you really look further into the text tells us that you must what? Restore what you took. And your humanity has been taken for all these years. So what type of policies have been put in place to restore your humanity, right? To repair what has been taken from you, right? So these are things that these questions plays along and goes along with the economic part of what we're talking about here, and how even as a slave in those days, right? Psychologically speaking, black people still today have that same type of mentality as far as subservience. You hear your parents tell you, oh yeah, you got to major in this so you can go out there and get a good job. But how many of your parents tell you, you have to major in this so that you can learn how to what? Create a job. And so that's what I'm saying here, get the degree. Study hard. Go as high as you can go as education allows you to go in your field. However, don't just stop your mentality of saying, I got to get a good job. Again, how are we going to create those jobs? How are we going to create those opportunities? How are you going to serve your community and create opportunities for your community and help pull the next person up who looks like you? And not just beating them down and beating them overhead and being a crab in the bucket just so you could chase individual accolades. Because that's what you were trained to do as a slave when you were in the slave quarters. Keep that dissension going. And in fact, you were trained so well that eventually a slave master ain't even got to tell you how to respond. You know how to respond yourself. Carter G. Woodson taught us that in Miseducation of the Negro. How many of you read that book? And we think we know. Not a hand raised in here, but we really don't know. We really don't know. We're clueless. I'm still learning myself. That's the great thing about it. And so when we're looking at worth, right? So these aren't even the current numbers. These numbers are back from 2016, right? 2016. I have updated numbers that are coming. But in looking at the average worth of a black person in this country, as I said before, black, $139,000 as far as net worth. White, $919,000. You see the wide disparity. So again, what is your worth in this country? And so when we look at the stats today, we see that $933,000, the average net worth of a white family, $138,000 average net worth of a black family. And I also want to clue you in as far as the numbers, as far as the mean net housing wealth. So as was said before, typically the way to wealth in this country is to first procuring real estate, because we know real estate is going to protect you from from rents jumping up each. Rent goes up each year. I am a landlord, and I raise rent every year because I have to make sure that I am keeping up with the taxes, right? Taxes go up every year. So what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna pass that cost down to my tenants, right? So when you own a home, the only thing that goes up, well, several things could go up. One being taxes, right? And then two being the HOA if you have an HOA, right? But for the most part, it allows you to shield yourself from rent being disproportionately going up in this country. So now if you look at the mean net housing wealth of an average white family, $215,000, the mean net worth of an average white family as far as their house is concerned. Their real estate. But when you look at the average black family who owns a home, their net worth of their house is only worth $94,000. That's nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. At the lowest bottom of the total pole. Even Hispanics, Latinos are beating black people. So to really augment that, you have to have an entrepreneurial spirit, as we said before, right? Being entrepreneurial is very important. So, and I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a skill that you should have even when you have a job and you have that wage, right? Because everybody has to start somewhere. But while you're at that starting point, develop that entrepreneurial spirit, right? So according to Howard Stevenson, entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources control. Beyond resources control, no entrepreneur has everything at the outset, but leverage what you do have. And what do you have as a black person? You have knowledge and you have muscle memory. As we said before, as we already established, black people in this country have long been entrepreneurs. How else are you going to survive this country for the amount of time for the oppression? So acquire appreciating assets. How do we get to that wealth building? Creating enterprises and business ventures. It could be really small, as far starting a lemonade stand. It's a business venture. It's an enterprise. Procuring real estate. Write a book, because from books you could get what? Royalties, right? Everybody, you know, this latest trend of having the most Instagram followers and thinking you're going to get paid off of Instagram and social media, please. Doing off a wing and a prayer, all right? And last one. And lastly, what you want to do is be able to manage your debt. Manage your debt. It's very important. Credit cards, real estate mortgages, equity line of credit, those are good debt to have, right? Even one of the strategies that I like to take is that once you get to a point, even if it's just starting off as getting a Walmart card, you get that Walmart card, you swipe it every month, but you make sure you pay it off every month. Build that credit up, start building up, and then so what happens is they want to increase your line of credit on that card. Okay, build it up, build it up, build it up, and then so what happens is that you maybe start being able to qualify for what? An interest-free credit card, right? Interest-free for maybe 15 months, if your credit's good enough. Build that up, build that up, build that up, and don't ever close down a credit card account. Don't ever close one down, because that's going to negatively impact your credit, especially if you're at the point of trying to buy a house. Okay? So I just want to leave you with that, and I close with this. Black people, I cannot tell you enough how important it is to start thinking about what you're actually worth in this society. And not just from a sociological standpoint, but actually in real numbers, in real dollars, right? Because, as I said before, the average white person with no degree is worth over $350,000, while the average black person with a degree is only worth $267,000. And that $267,000 is even lower if you account for just black women. So these are the things as black people, as black man, black woman, whatever you identify as, you have to start thinking in those terms so you can start preparing yourself for when downturns in the economy occur, recessions, that type of thing.